Lots of folks saying hello. Hi, Patty. Hi, Ryan. Oh, we have a teacher candidate from the Barrie area. Hello. Hi, Kathy from Cloca. Excited to see so many folks signing in. Hi, Joanne. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
Good. If you want to mute your camera once we get everybody welcomed here, then we'll get you up and ready to share.
Okay. Did you say mute my camera?
Yeah, if you can do that.
Yep, I sure can.
And your mic too, if you want.
Yep, I'll do that.
Hi, Sharon. I'm seeing lots and lots of folks joining. It's really nice to see so many familiar names. Yes, there's a question. Yeah, everybody else's mics and cameras are already muted because we are in a webinar format, so you don't have to worry about doing that yourselves. Yeah, so anybody who's joining, you might have noticed the housekeeping notes that are up on the screen. Oops. Not sure how I did that. Let's go back. Sorry about that. This webinar is being recorded, so I just want everybody to know that moving forward. Of course, some of you are already introducing yourselves in the chat box. There will be a question answer period at the end of the presentation, but if there is something that comes up during the presentation, please use the question and answer box. You should be able to find that when you move your mouse, it'll sort of pop up at the bottom. It's a Q&A icon, so please use that for questions and answers during the presentation. And if anybody is having technical difficulties, please contact Karen and Nikisha in the chat or via email there. If you're having them now to help, they can help you try and sort those out. So we just have one more minute until 2 o'clock. We'll wait and let some more folks join in. So we're still seeing some names popping up here. Excited to see new folks. Hi, Stana. I'm grateful to be here too. And I think for the sake of time, there's a few folks still rolling in, but I think we should get started. It is just 2 o'clock now. Hi, Tara from UTRCA. Okay, so I'm just going to unmute my video so that I can say hello to everybody. My name is Melissa Levi. I work for St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, and I'm excited to be your moderator here today. We are here, of course, everybody's here to listen to Steve Styers, who is joining us from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And hopefully everybody has seen some of the housekeeping notes that are up. I will bring them up afterwards. What I would like to do first is I would like to share my screen with you all. And start with our land acknowledgement. So this land acknowledgement that we are sharing today is actually borrowed. It was created by the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study. It was created by a group of grade 6 students. I had the pleasure of viewing this document in a webinar a few months ago. And when I watched and listened to this, I was very impacted by the words that were written. I apologize if you guys can see my notes. I'm not sure why. Let's see if I can fix this. I'm just going to keep going. I apologize if you can see my notes, but I am in presenter view, so I'm just going to keep going for the sake of time. So as I was saying, I had the pleasure of viewing this document in a webinar I participated in a few months ago. And when I watched and listened to it, I was very impacted by the words that were written by a group of such young students. I'm excited to share it with you all here today. And as I mentioned, it was created by a group of grade 6s after an extensive learning process. So this process involved teacher-led lessons, student-led research, reading, and consultation with Indigenous communities and elders. The creation of this land acknowledgement was guided by the idea that a land acknowledgement as a stagnant document can be inherently problematic. The goals of this project were to create an ever-changing, evolving land acknowledgement that could be adaptive and growing constantly. So we share this 2019 version as an example only to assist conservation educators and others that are joining us today on their own journeys towards creating and using a land acknowledgement in their own watersheds. The teacher behind this process, her name was Krista Spence, and she suggested to me that the keys to the success of this project were understanding where we currently are in our relationships, understanding what actions we need to take into the future, and most importantly, building new relationships and developing new ways of working with Indigenous teachers, artists, elders, and community members. So I'm going to try and take it off the presenter view, so hopefully the rest of you can see what I want you to see as I share this.
That looks good, Melissa.
Thanks, Karen. So Krista also wanted me to mention that there is a new land acknowledgement being created this year. So this is something that they hope to be able to do every year at their school to keep that document evolving and growing. So I will read the acknowledgement for you, but please keep in mind that it is coming from a grade 6 voice. We begin with acknowledgement of the land because we will be using the land and need to respect this place where Indigenous people lived and continue to live. We wrote this to share some of our learning and to teach others. We thought about who would be hearing it, and we didn't want to make it too complicated or too simple. We would like to thank the first peoples of this land and all of creation, including the animals, plants, land, water, air, rocks, trees, and all that exists on this beautiful earth. We honor the Indigenous people whose traditional territories included the land on which we gather today, the Petun, the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and other nations whose names we no longer remember because of the impacts of colonialism. We want to honor the treaties that were made with the land and between First Nations and the Crown. Treaties should be honored, no matter what political party is in power. The story of Canada that most of us know is not the whole story. We have been learning from Indigenous sources about losing language and culture through residential schools, and also about ceremony, celebration, and strength of community. When we are thinking about doing something to the land, like building a dam or pipelines, we should ask Indigenous people first, because they lived in balance with nature for thousands of years. We have lost our relationship to the earth by doing things like polluting and taking too much. We need to ask ourselves, what is most important, what I get out of this or what happens to the land? We need to think 7 generations ahead. What we do today, how will that affect tomorrow? We invite you to do the same. Thank you. So, as I mentioned before, I found that really impactful. I hope some of you did as well. And in the recording that you will all be receiving of this webinar after, you should be able to go back and look at that. And perhaps it can help you guys in your futures thinking about land acknowledgements in your own watersheds. Hopefully everybody has seen the housekeeping pieces here. So the webinar is being recorded. Please feel free to use the chat box. If you do have questions during Steve's presentation, please use the Q&A function. So it'll be easier for us to keep track of questions that way. So please do not put them in the chat. Please put them in the question and answer. And hopefully everybody's got their technical difficulties worked out. But if there's anything that you still need, please contact Karen and Nikisha directly through the chat or through those emails. So I am going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Nina, who is going to welcome us on behalf of the WIN committee.
Ready? Thanks, Melissa. That was really a lovely way to begin our conference. So on behalf of myself and the rest of the Rekindle committee, made up of Dan Schneider, Melissa Levi, Chris Evans, Sam Keller, Karen Bromberg, Naomi Saunders, Bonnie Anderson, Emily Fabre, Stana Luckford-Odie, Will Sorley, Krista Frazackerly, Sherry Owens, Brenna Bartley, and of course, Nikisha Mohammed. Welcome to Rekindle 2020. Typically, we meet in person, but we are so glad that we are able to meet virtually this year and hope that we can meet in person again soon. I would like to express my sincere gratitude for all of our committee members and all of the hard work that they've put in to ensure that we have the opportunity to meet and share this year, especially during this time. All of us, we have learned and adapted and utilized more technology than outdoor educators probably ever thought they would in putting this conference together. So we are really proud of what we've been able to do. We're excited to present this week's webinars. Today's on land-based education and reconciliation, benthic invertebrates tomorrow, forest therapy on Thursday, and a virtual campfire on Friday. Speaking of the virtual campfire, if you would like to share, there's still some sharing spots available for that. So you can email Dan directly if you've already signed up for the webinar and didn't indicate that you wanted to share, but have changed your mind since, you can do that, or just sign up regularly. Karen will provide Dan's email in the chat box, so you can copy that down if you want to share. And then on Friday, as always, we will be presenting the Outstanding Achievement Award and the Innovation Award. We're really excited this year. We have seen tons of innovation across all conservation authorities because we've had to. So be sure to vote for the Innovation Award winner. I believe there are 6 nominees, and please vote by 10 a.m. on Friday, or better yet, just after this webinar is done. Karen has dropped the link to vote for the Innovation Award in the chat box, so you can find it there. Maybe click on it now so the window's open, and then when you're done here, you can go over there and vote. So during a year where we, where am I? Yeah. So also coming up in January, the Rekindle Committee, which is made up of all of the members that I listed at the beginning. So we represent the Watershed Interpreters Network, or the WIN Network, which is a network of conservation authority educators across the province. I was really happy to see we have a couple people from some of our northern CAs able to join us for the webinar today. We'll be putting out a call for people to join the committee in January. So think about whether you want to join us in the future, and you can do that in January. All right, I'm going to turn things back over to Melissa to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Nina. Okay, so I am super, super excited about today, everybody. We have a gentleman by the name of Steve Styers. He is a Mohawk, part of the Wolf Clan from Six Nations Grand River Territory. He has been in First Nation education for over 25 years and a principal for 15 years. He currently is the principal and director of education at Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. Also works for the former Prime Minister Paul Martin in the Model Literacy Program, and also teaches at the University of Ottawa. The foundation of his practice is supported by First Nation culture and language, and enhancing and supporting student success. So Steve is here today to talk to us about land-based education. This session reviews Indigenous perspectives of land-based education and what land-based education looks like at his school, Hillside Elementary. Indigenous and Western worldview usually conflict over land and land-based education. Today, Steve will illustrate ways these two worldviews can actually support and enhance each other. Lastly, we will look at how Indigenous land perspectives can inform all stewards of place. From a personal perspective, I've had the honor of working with Steve for the past 2 years on a project aiming to incorporate some conservation science into the Ojibwe and land-based ed programs at Hillside School. I personally find Steve to be a wealth of information, a patient ally, and an open sharer of personal and cultural knowledge, something that I'm incredibly grateful for. On many occasions, I've had the pleasure of chatting with Steve, asking questions and listening to his stories and teachings. I always feel more informed, motivated, and uplifted afterwards. So I'm super grateful for Steve being here today and agreeing to share with all of you. I sincerely hope that you all enjoy his teachings as I have had the chance to do. So on behalf of the Watershed Interpreters Network and everybody else joining us today, welcome, Steve. So I'm going to have you unmute your camera and we'll get your presentation up on the screen.
Thank you for that introduction, Melissa. Very kind words. Hadn't heard the grade 6 land acknowledgement before, and really appreciate the work that those young people put in to that land acknowledgement. One of the things I like that they did is they went beyond human beings and they acknowledged all the other life on the land that is essential for place. So I don't know if there's too much I can add to that introduction. If we could go to the next slide. And the next slide. So what we're going to talk about today is some characteristics of Indigenous worldview. Then, as the introduction indicated, we're going to find ways where those usually conflicting worldviews, where they can come together and create some different understanding. The Truth and Reconciliation document that's about reconciliation, there's many pages about what reconciliation means, but it really boils down to one word, and that's understanding. And that's how reconciliation occupies land-based education, is creating that understanding between worldviews. We'll be talking about place from an Indigenous perspective, knowledge keepers that are in our communities, the efforts that we undertook at Walpole Island Elementary School, which is now called Bikajwanan Kinamagigamuk, Wissaxin Kinamagigamuk. Kinamagigamuk is a word that means place of learning. And then we'll talk about that perspective of land as our first teacher, pedagogy of the land. And lastly, the efforts that we're working with at Hillside with Melissa. So if we go to the next slide. Indigenous Worldview, there's a great book called How It Is by someone who's passed away, V.F. Cordova. She was an Apache woman who taught Western philosophy at the university level, I believe in Utah, maybe, I forget which state. But anyways, her book, How It Is, a lot of First Nations people give it credit in terms of it's the best articulation of Indigenous philosophy in English. I'll be talking about through this presentation how Indigenous languages are really a gatekeeper to our knowledge, our worldview, and a lot of history and ceremony. And if you're not a fluent speaker, that does create problems. I'm not a fluent speaker. But anyways, what she talks about worldview is it's a description of the world, a description of what it is to be human in the world, and a description of our role in the world. We say there's 3 laws. There's law of God, creator, whatever we call the creator of this place. That's first on that hierarchy, then comes land. And then lastly are human beings. And obviously human beings cannot circumvent the laws of land and with the creator. Could I have the next slide, please? In Indigenous worldview, there's a phrase we use a lot of times and at the end of the ceremonies too. And when translated, it comes out to all our relations. And we always have that acknowledgement, that relationship. Ceremony is really rebuilding relationships, renewing relationships, enhancing relationships with place, animals, plants. And I'll talk a little bit later about how deep those relationships go in a traditional context. But it talks about all our relations, and all those relationships are reciprocal. That's a foundation of our culture, that there's always this give and take, this sharing, giving back when we take. And even though it may not be a general thought, traditional knowledge is just as important as Western science. What I like to say about traditional knowledge is it's a knowledge that was built in one particular way, and it was built from Indigenous people living in a place for tens of thousands of years. And during those tens of thousands of years, observing, experimenting, developing relationships and building that knowledge throughout those centuries. So, you know, we were very, very good at occupying our space on the land because we recognize the laws of the land. We understood those relationships with plants and animals intimately. I'll go on to the next one. So I talked a little bit about the language. And okay, thank you, that's good. Traditional knowledge is given by the creator. That's where we say this knowledge comes from, which is kind of an obvious logical thought. If the creator made everything, then that knowledge comes through creator. Traditional knowledge has spiritual and physical aspects in balance. And actually what we say is that all of life has those 4 quadrants that we have as human beings. All life has a mental capacity, a spiritual capacity, a physical capacity, and an emotional capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but all life contains those aspects. Even rocks, which is a pretty hefty concept, thinking that a rock is alive. I could probably do it some justice, but once again, that's really knowledge that's contained within the language, and that's some really specific knowledge that certain people would have. It's passed down from generation to generation, as I said, thousands of years old. And it's really why we still survive to this day. There were some pretty horrific efforts to eradicate Indigenous people in North America, but our strength came from the land. Our strength came from the way we treated each other, and our communities were based on relationships on the land. And it had to do with not amassing material things, taking care of others, different things like that. So a lot of the ways we treated each other and formed our communities came directly from the way the land organizes those things. Traditional knowledge is diverse, you know, as many different places as there are. There's the diverse teachings and diverse history in all those places. And we say, you know, our research is through vision and dream and songs and prayers and stories and dances. I was doing a master's at Queens, and it was one of the first universities that recognized these structures as research. So as we wrote papers or did other assignments, we could reference these different things if it fit into what we were working on. Next slide, please. Just want to talk real quickly about what some of the systemic issues we have in First Nations education. We have our language that's in crisis. Every band operated school on reserve is trying to hold on to that language because once again, it contains our culture, our ways of being, that intimate, deep knowledge is in the language. If we were in a longhouse or in some type of ceremony and I was fluent and I was trying to translate what was being said in the language, it'd be very difficult because there's a lot of the concepts we have, there's not words or phrases in the English language that really capture it. We also have colonizing curriculum right here in Ontario, and I'll point to one of the expectations in the science curriculum where it says, what are the physical characteristics of plants and animals? Now, as a teacher, if that's kind of where my knowledge is, and I'm teaching a group of First Nations kids, and we're talking about plants and animals, and I'm just teaching the physical aspects, well, I'm gonna say that we're somewhat, not somewhat, but we're being agents of assimilation. We're being agents of colonization. And when we sit in front of First Nation students, if we're not sure how to deliver that knowledge, if we deliver it in small pieces, and due to residential school, a lot of our own teachers struggle with this sometimes to deliver this knowledge on equal footing. There's a great academic named Dr. Leroy Littlebear who says, in all of our classrooms, in every subject throughout every day, both worldviews should be equal. And if they're not, once again, we're agents of colonization and assimilation. Naturally, though, when we bring those two worldviews on equal footing in the classroom, we don't make any value judgments. Those are family decisions. So even in our school at Hillside, we're working towards that level. I mean, it takes years of curriculum development and teacher professional development to get there, but that's where we're heading, and that's our goal there. And also, we got to remember that these schools are really the same structure, similar to residential schools. So a lot of our communities say we have to indigenize our school. So when I referred to Walpole Elementary, my term as principal, we got the community to vote on a name. That was one step towards indigenizing. I asked who Walpole was. I'm not sure who that guy was. It was a guy, and the explanation I got was, oh, this is some guy who wandered through the territory at some point, which doesn't give it much meaning. But anyways, we wanted to start indigenizing the school. So that was one of the first things we did. And you'll see when I talk about Walpole, we started attacking that curriculum and bringing that land base into the school. And my last point there is Indian Affairs mandates school reviews every 5 years for our schools. And essentially what that is interviews with all the stakeholders. And at Walpole Island, the community said, we want culture and language throughout every subject, throughout every day. And we want the school to create a repository of knowledge. That may sound like an odd thing, but when you realize our elders are disappearing quickly, our language is disappearing quickly, our cultural knowledge is disappearing quickly, the community said, look, traditionally, these people kept the knowledge. They're passing away, and some of that knowledge, so they were looking to the school, and I'll talk about this process more in a few minutes, how we brought those knowledge keepers in, and we grabbed the teachings and started creating that cultural repository of knowledge, which is one of the few ways to try and hang on to the knowledge at Walpole. Next slide, please. Before Oren Lyons, there's a video that I think you guys will have a chance to look at. We didn't want to show it here. There was a few tech issues, but it's a 7-minute video, and I love showing this video to students and teachers. And I'll just tell you quickly who he is and sort of what he says in the video. Oren Lyons is one of our chiefs. He's actually of the 6 nations. One of those nations is the Onondaga, and Oren Lyons is an Onondaga man. He's chief in the Longhouse. Very smart man, very good speaker, and has done a lot for our culture. But the video, he talks about how when he came back from university, he was one of the first people who graduated from University in Onondaga, his uncle, he came back and his uncle said to him, hey, you wanna go fishing? And Oren Lyons said, sure, let's go fishing. So they go out fishing, and as they're fishing, his uncle says to Oren Lyons, so you went to university, that's good. You must have learned a lot. And he pauses a bit, then he goes, what did you learn about yourself? And so Oren Lyons is feeling, he's feeling kind of full of himself. He graduated from university, so he starts telling his uncle who he is. Well, this is my longhouse name. These are all my relatives. And this is what I know. And then he presses them some more. He goes, what else can you tell me about who you are? And Oren Lyons realized, I need some help here. And his uncle goes, do you need some help? He goes, yeah. And so his uncle looks to a bluff, and there's a tree there. Its roots are just barely hanging onto the tree, onto the bluff. And he says to Oren Lyons, you see that tree? That's who you are. Dependent on the earth. And he goes on and talks a little bit about that. So when you get a chance to look at that video, take a look at it. It's a really nice short story that illustrates where we are in this place. We're dependent, totally dependent on place. And so one of his quotes from a book called Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future, he says, the spiritual side of the natural world is absolute. The laws are absolute. Our instructions, I'm talking about for all human beings, are instructions to get along. Understand what the laws are, get along with the laws, support them, work with them. We were told a long time ago that if we do that, life is endless. It continues on and on in great cycles of life regenerating, and regenerating. Obviously, we're not getting along with place these days. And his last statement that life will continue on, that's in jeopardy these days. And so it's a very poignant and clear quote from Oren Lyons. If I could have the next slide, please. Another great academic is Gregory Cajete. He's a Pueblo from New Mexico. And he wrote a book called Native Science, which is a great book articulating our thoughts on what Native science is. And he talks about in his book, Native Science reflects a celebration of renewal. The ultimate aim is not explaining an objectified universe, but rather learning about and understanding our responsibilities and relationships with place and earth, and celebrating those that humans establish with the world, those good sustaining relationships that are in harmony and peace and balance with place. Native science is about that mutual reciprocity, which simply means a give and take relationship with the natural world, which presupposes a responsibility to care for, sustain, respect the right of living things, plants, animals, and the places in which we live. This is the foundation of our native science. Next slide, please. He goes on, the maintenance of a dynamic balance and harmony with all relationships to nature is foundational paradigm of native science. The earth is alive and nurtures all things of her body. All have intelligence, all have a right to exist. People have a history in place, a history of relationships with each other. People have a history with regard to plants, animals, nature, and all things in nature. There's a thing we talk about when we're in the bush, and they refer to it as spiritual DNA or cultural DNA. But I think everyone experiences it in place. And looking at those histories of relationships, when we've all come to that place and said, hold on, there's something special here. There's something here. And that's that history. That's that spirit that place has. That history of relationships that it's had with place. We're told when we see a bear in the bush, obviously walk back slowly, but talk to the bear in the language. The bear has heard that language for thousands of years. It's familiar. Next slide, please. Ceremony is both a context for transferring knowledge and a way to remember the responsibilities that we have to our relationships with life. Native ceremony is associated with maintaining and restoring balance, renewal, cultivating relationships, and creative participation with nature. In the intimate relationships with plants, Native people became sensitive to the fact that each plant has its own energy. Coming to know or understand the essence of plants evolves over extensive experience and participation with green nature. There's people on my reserve at Six Nations that are medicine people. And they have such deep, intimate relationship with plants that those spirits, those plants come and talk to them in dreams and instruct them how to use the plant to help people heal. And back in the day when we were in the context of place, when we're living on the land all the time, we had those intimate relationships. A few people do these days who have that cultural knowledge, but we always asked place for help. So animals came to us and offered help. Plants came to us and offered help. And that's really what place is about. That's what life is about, is helping each other survive. Next slide, please. I won't read this whole thing. I'll let you look at it as, I'm just going to talk about one thing on this slide, is the Thanksgiving address. I mentioned we use the phrase, all my relations. My people have a Thanksgiving address. It's not really a prayer. It's exactly what it says. It's a Thanksgiving. And when it's said in its entirety, it takes about an hour and a half. And whenever we open important meetings or ceremonies, we start off with this address. And what this address does, it centers us in where we're supposed to be. It'll either start in the sky or it'll start in the ground. If it starts in the sky, the person talking about this address will acknowledge everything. It'll talk about the stars. It'll talk about the thunder and the lightning. It'll talk about the rain. It'll talk about the winds. It'll talk about, when it gets down to earth, plants, trees, animals, the rivers, Mother Earth's blood. And it talks about all the gifts those things give us. It acknowledges. So when it says plants, the speaker will say how the plants benefit us and how the plants take care of us. And at the end of each of those statements, we say, our mind is one. And so at the end of that Thanksgiving address, we've acknowledged everything around us, that place. We've talked about what they offer us and our relationship. So when we get onto that important meeting, our mind we have a good mind, and we're in that place that acknowledges and recognizes our gifts. And that's the point. We want to start talking about those important things that have to do with our community and other matters. Next slide, please. So why place-based education in schools? Well, obviously to us as Indigenous people, we say it belongs in school because it was our first teacher. The land is our first teacher and continues to be our first teacher. We know the land is healing. When those animals get hurt and they rub in the dirt, they know that earth is healing. And all our healing comes from the earth. No matter what you pick up at Shoppers Drug Mart, it eventually came from the earth. The earth is healing and it takes care of us. The other important reason for land-based education is, as the other point says, due to our current environmental crisis, we all need to learn about stewardship and what that means in responsibility to place. And land-based education also teaches about relationships with the world. And land-based education, as educators, we know we can take almost any subject matter and integrate it into all the core subjects. Land-based education can be integrated very easily into math, language arts, art, music, all these things. Land-based education fits very well into our Ontario curriculum. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about Wasauksing. That was one of the first schools I was a principal at. Beautiful place just outside Parry Sound. It's an island. It used to be called Parry Island First Nation. And when I first got there in that community, I was so happy because this was a community who was really trying hard to bring culture back, not just to the school, but the community. I'll show you a picture in a little bit of a sweat lodge we had right on our playground that we used to support our staff and our students who would request a sweat. And our native language teacher, Hector Kapagog, he could facilitate sweats. So we had that great teaching tool right on our playground. A great story I'm going to tell you in a little bit about reconciling worldviews comes from a fasting that we did up there. We had the big drum there. We taught the kids how to sing those songs. We started localizing our curriculum to reflect place, the bears that were there and the different ecosystems that were there and the history of the spiritual part of place there. And we tried to get outside the classroom in every effort we could. The community was changing signage to have Indigenous language instead of English language, and a lot of other things were changing. It's a community that was very active in hunting and fishing and following the protocols of taking life and acknowledging life when we take it. Next slide, please. So this is where we used to live, and this was our backyard, and it was just the most beautiful place. It was heaven to look out our window and see that. And I loved living there. There was bears that went through our yard. There was moose that went through our yard. It was just the greatest place, one of the greatest places we ever lived in. It was such a beautiful place. We were there for 6 years and really enjoyed the community and was really treated well. The next slide. And so this is another picture of the bay there from Perry Island, from Wissahickon. Another statement of how beautiful it was. Next slide. And there's one of our neighbors who would come around. We had a few neighbors like this that would roll around in our laundry and just be lounging around. It was really cool to have bears around and see and watch them and learn from them. We say bears are medicine. Bears are a really strong animal. People that are from the bear clan are medicine people. And there's lots of teachings around the bear and why we call that a medicine animal. The next slide, please. And this was our school to the left, and then the sweat lodge. And we used to, once again, take the kids out there, and it was a beautiful thing to have that kind of support. Talking about indigenizing the school, this is a great example of steps towards that, of indigenizing our school. And it was a great experience there. Next slide, please. Let me just review my slide here. Melissa, could you just go a slide or two further? I just need to see. Professional pool. And one more. Okay, if we go back to where we were, right there. Okay, great. I'm going to tell you a story of kind of how this reconciliation of worldviews kind of came to me and some enlightenment that I had. So at Wissahickon, we would take the kids fasting. Even my own daughter went fasting with us. And when we went out to pick the saplings to make our lodge, Hector Copagog, once again, our native language teacher, said, okay, we're in this maple community here. We got to find the mother tree, because that mother tree takes care of all these other trees in all those ways, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, in all those ways. And he said, let's take our tobacco and go to that mother tree. You put the tobacco there and you tell that mother tree, I'm going to take one of these little maple saplings. I'm going to tell you why. And I want to give you thanks for letting us use this. And we thank the Creator for that. And you know, if you're not an Indigenous person, or if you're not someone who's really familiar with relationships in place, that thought of a mother tree taking care of other trees, it's almost like a Disney fantasy film. Oh, what is this tree going to hug the other trees? Is it going to talk to the other? It almost seems like a bit much, I think, for people to think that, well, hold on, this piece of wood takes care of these other, and they have relationships. It's a leap for some people. Anyways, so that's indigenously, that's how we view those things. When we're taking something, we always have a protocol to acknowledge that life, and we're very aware of the relationships in place. So a couple of years went by, and I was watching David Suzuki on the nature of things. And this particular episode was called Smarty Plants. And Melissa, if you could just start going down to the pictures of the tree, and then we'll come back this way. Keep going. Right there, if you hold off right there for a moment. So David Suzuki knew about this indigenous concept of mother tree. So he wanted to use scientific method and try and prove this concept of this big mother tree taking care of other trees. So if we could go to the next slide. And so he sent some scientists out to a Douglas fir community. And as you can see, these two people are about to put a big plastic bag over that branch. And then if we go to the next slide, they're pumping in carbon dioxide, food for the tree that has radioactivity in it also. So if we go to the next slide. So they pumped the bag with food. They went away for 3 days. Then they came back, and you can see them with Geiger counters, following the root system where that tree delivers nutrition, knowledge, and help for the family. And if you get a chance to see this episode, you'll see them following the root system. And sure enough, all this food that they gave the big mother tree, I mean, it could have been a big dumb piece of wood that just ate it. But what they proved through scientific method, catching up with indigenous science, is sure enough that biggest mother tree had pushed all the food past the mature trees, the teenager trees, to the smallest, most vulnerable trees. So this mother tree took that food and fed those little children in that community, which is a great way of bringing these two worldviews together. You have something that we know as indigenous people when we go fasting, and it's just knowledge we have that life takes care of life. And here you have David Suzuki, a fan of indigenous science, proving some of our concepts through scientific method. That's a reconciliation. There's a guy at Guelph. There's a scientist there who has proven cabbage plants talk to each other. So I really like this thought that Western science is catching up with us. Unfortunately for the man at Guelph, he's such a Darwinistic type of guy. He said these plants talk to each other, but he doesn't understand why they want to protect each other. Because what the cabbage plants do is when a certain bug comes, it emits a chemical to tell the other cabbage plants, hey, we need to emit this other chemical to repel this bug. So through scientific method, he said, he proved they talk to each other. He just couldn't understand the family concept of plants, of why they would want to take care of each other. So a lot of ways for reconciliation. So if we can go back to where we were, Melissa. One more. So let me just take a, okay, so that's what happened at Wissahickon. We started some of those things, and then for me, that big kind of aha moment with David Suzuki proving the mother tree concept, that's an indigenous concept. I started thinking about other ways to reconcile those two worldviews. You know, because of residential school, we know as educators, whenever we teach something, our stepping in point is, where is the prior knowledge? What do these children already know? And once I establish what they know, I then can step in and then begin teaching a concept at that point. Unfortunately, because of residential school and all the efforts of colonization, assimilation, marginalization, a lot of our children, a lot of our people have lost cultural knowledge. So when we started teaching this at Walpole Island, when I was principal there for 6 years, they didn't have the prior knowledge of land and those relationships. Some of the children who came from strong cultural families may have had it, but for the most part, they didn't. And so we developed this statement. It's not an original concept, but it's a statement. And what we told those children was, all plants and animals have a sense of self, family, community, and standards of behavior. And I'll talk about in a little bit how we began to teach this concept. Because before we could even go out and interact with place or start learning from place or letting the land teach us, we needed to create this prior knowledge. Without this prior knowledge, we would have skipped steps. Now, going back to what I said about language, really all of this should be taught in the language. But a lot of us are in this predicament. Going back to Dr. Leroy Littlebear, he talks about the fact that there's not too many First Nations people with a worldview intact due to residential school and all those things. He said we all have jagged worldviews. And so this is our way of putting those pieces together to create that puzzle and try and create that concept and try and reclaim and recapture some of the things we lost. So this prior knowledge piece, this is the first thing we had to do in our school. We had to teach these lessons in the classroom. And once again, because of residential school, a lot of our own First Nations teachers don't have this knowledge. So we had to start doing a lot of PD with our staff. This is how we're going to teach this concept as land of our first teacher, pedagogy of the land. And so we started with that. If we could go to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about this, the PD with the staff. Chief and council and the community was very supportive. One of the first steps we took, because I'm going to say a little bit about oral knowledge keepers. Oral knowledge keepers are the people in our community that have our cultural knowledge. And most of our knowledge is oral. You look at history, we have very distinctive, different stories around history. Look at John A. MacDonald. Textbooks in the classroom have a story about John A. MacDonald that Canada wants their students to know. We have a story of John A. MacDonald that's vastly different from that one, that talks about the architect of residential school, talks about his philosophy of ethnocide, of assimilating First Nations people. So that's why oral knowledge keepers are so important in our communities, because they have our knowledge. Our knowledge isn't on the internet. I can't go to a book in the library and figure out how to do that ceremony. I can't go to some sort of presentation and learn about the intimate parts of my culture. So we had the help of those oral knowledge keepers. So the first thing we did is we sat in the library, we recorded everyone's name. This person had fished their whole life, so this person had knowledge of how to take life, that protocol, knew about the waters. Another guy, Dave White, a great oral historian from Walpole Island, we put his name down there as oral history. And we came up with about 40 people that had specific knowledge that we wanted to bring into the school. We then sent 2 university young men to go out and do our protocol of how we ask elders for knowledge. And so they went out and gave them tobacco and told them what our intent was and asked, would you be willing to come in and share your knowledge with the school? And all 40 people said yes. Now here's where a lot of schools drop the ball in bringing culture and knowledge into the school. A lot of people will have like a cultural week or someone come in and talk about history. And they're kind of these one-off things, extracurricular things. We said at Walpole, we got to capture this knowledge. Remember, the community wanted a repository of knowledge, but also our job as teachers was to grab the knowledge that they were bringing in, document it through PLCs, professional learning communities. How do we take this knowledge and entrench it in curriculum and classroom practice? That was our next step, our next work that we had to do. Unfortunately, this was all occurring my last year at Walpole, and I left before we could see this through. And took my place. Also made sure it didn't work out well. There were some things that got in the way of doing that. But anyways, if we could go to the next slide. So at the school, we recognize those worldview tensions. I talked about the prior knowledge, the language disclaimer, identifying all knowledge keepers in our next steps in the school. And if I could see the next slide. And we started talking about that concept. Land is our first teacher. Mother Earth is the life-giving source, not a resource. We're part of the earth, not a part of it. Our culture is centered in place, is the other concept we started teaching. In our creation stories, in all of our creation stories, it instructs us what we're supposed to do to get along. Remember what Gregory, Cajete, and Lyons was saying. We have to get along with life and enhance those relationships and learn about those relationships. So our stewardship responsibility, that's in our creation story. We know that's part of what we do. That's our responsibility in this place. We can go to the next slide. And so we can go to the next one. These were the pictures that we looked at. Just a quick note about plants. I like this statement. This is from Gregory Cajete also. Plants exemplify the operations of the natural laws of nature. Life seeking life, we know that about plants. Life gives life and supports life. And every turn, every moment, every opportunity, plants seek to live their lives and in turn support all life, including human beings. That's their responsibility. That's their traditional knowledge. That's their role from creator. And that's just one example of how all life works together and has responsibility to support other life. Plants and humans have always been intertwined. There's no plants, there's no humans. In the intimate relationships with plants, Native people became sensitive to the fact that each has its own energy. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that those traditional people came to understand the essence of that plant over extensive experiences and participation with land. The next slide, please. So here we are at Hillside Elementary. And I got hired here, as Melissa stated, this is my second year. And I got hired here because they wanted to do this land-based education. And it's a great opportunity for me to continue my learning and my teaching of land-based education, because this is what the community wants. And I just want to say a few words about Melissa here. We've been very lucky to find that partnership with her. It's those two worldviews working together without bias, without prejudice, and both of us and the school are open to all these other different knowledges. That's what being traditional is taking the tools at your disposal and making a better life for yourself and for place. And so it's a great opportunity for us to work together. And teaching is a tricky thing. You got to have a spirit there. You got to be able to establish relationships. And Melissa has done a really good job of establishing those relationships and trust and helping us with this. And so we are just beginning our components of lesson planning in the classroom, creating and delivering that prior knowledge to our students. And Melissa has actually taken a step to get the kids out to place. I've taken on this new role of director of ed, so I'm having some time constraint issues, but I'll work them out. So we haven't been able to do that place extensively, but I'm thankful to Melissa. They're going out on the land and they're beginning to identify who's who, what plants are out there, what trees are out there, what animals are out there. And then once we identify those things, the next thing we look at, okay, how do those things work together? What are those relationships? As we said, plants enhancing life and supporting life. What does that look like between all those things in the bush behind our school? And then once we identify who's who and we talk about those relationships, we then talk about, okay, as stewards, as human beings, how do we fit into all those elaborate relationships? That web of life that we talk about, all those connections between all life. Where do we fit? What's our responsibility? What's our place? And then lastly, once we go through those things, and it takes a while to get through those things, how does the land teach us? And so I'll give you a few examples of that in a moment. Melissa, if you could go to the picture of the owl. I think it's further down. Oh, actually back up one, sorry. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm just skipping a point here. So this is another tricky part for students. And it's an Indigenous concept. And once again, our students don't have a lot of the prior knowledge, so we really come from kind of a generic place. And we try, well, we don't try, we deliver knowledge and we talk about how the land teaches us. Why is the land called our first teacher? How does pedagogy of the land, how does that look? But the thing we always talk about is we don't want to talk about the intelligence of a crow being like the intelligence of a human being. That's a crow. That's a crow, the essence of a crow. And whatever gifts that crow has, we know that crows transmit knowledge to their young. There's an experiment in the States where they sent a guy out with a mask and they were catching crows in the courtyard. But the guy had to wear the mask all the time. And they would take the crows and they would ban them and they would let them go. They waited a few years till those crows had another generation. So that new generation of crows never seen the man in the mask. A couple years went by before that man in the mask went out in the courtyard again. But when they sent him out there again, all those baby crows who never seen that man, they got very alarmed. And through that experiment, they established, those adult crows told that next generation, hey, you don't see him here now, but this guy who looks like this may come walking through, he's dangerous. And so anyways, we don't say, oh, that's a human trait, or, oh, look, they're intelligent like human beings. That they're intelligent like a crow. And so we start real simple. We ask the children, what do you learn from your dog? And so as we talk to children, we come up with all kinds of things we learn from our dog. We learn about loyalty. If you think about how enthusiastic your dog is when he or she greets you, we learn how to greet each other. We learn how to live in the moment. And dogs, my dog, I have a Cane Corso and Bull Mastiff. Me and my daughter watch our dog, and when it's with other dogs, it's a peacemaker. It gets between arguing dogs, and that's the role my dog has. And so if we're in tune to what those things have to offer us, those teachings, that knowledge, we can learn from the land. And once again, we start with our children. What do we learn from dogs? And we have all kinds of videos showing a bear that is in the zoo, and a crow fell into the water and couldn't get out. And it shows that bear. And at first you think the bear's going to eat that crow because he opens his mouth, but he gently grabs that crow, lifts him out, and puts him on the land. That's an amazing thing. And that's a bear showing us kindness, showing us just because that's a crow, that bear still has that sensitivity to life, supporting life. I'd like to show a picture of this owl. I really love this video. I'll tell you the story that goes with it if we go to the next slide. This owl was hurt. You can see the pupils are dilated. It had a head injury. It was near death. It's a great horned owl. It had bugs all over it. And they brought it to a predatory bird rehabilitation center, I think in Georgia, or maybe it's Indiana, I forget. Anyways, if you type in on YouTube, "man saves owl," you'll see this 2-minute clip. And so the clip shows you this guy named Doug, and he's holding this owl, and he's feeding it fresh meat. And then they start telling a little story. Doug, who's helping this owl, had to go visit family in Michigan. It was the first time since the owl came to the rehabilitation center that Doug and the owl had been separated. But so Doug went away for 2 weeks. And when Doug came back, if you could go to the next slide, Melissa. There he is feeding it. If you could go to the next slide. When Doug came back, this great horned owl climbed up his arm and put his wings around him. And that owl put its head next to his head. And we say to children, what is that owl doing? Now, once again, not having an Indigenous concept, someone like, oh, shoot, that's a wild owl from the bush. But we know these are our relations. We have relationships with these animals. And there's no hierarchy here. We all have the right to be here and to survive. We all have intelligence, as Gregory Cajete said. And so this owl, and the kids start saying, oh, that owl is showing appreciation. That owl is honoring that man. That owl is giving thanks. And so these are the videos we start to look at and demonstrating to our young children. This is how we learn from the land. Now, back in the day, we were right there in the bush. We didn't have to work in a wildlife rehabilitation center. Our relationships with plants and animals were every day, all day long. And our relationships, I sometimes think about what those relationships must have felt like, what they must have been like, those intimate relationships in place. And so these are the prior knowledge we start to create. Melissa, if you could go back to Hillside. I'm about at the end of my presentation here. And then I think we have just some time. If you go backwards, right there. And so our next step is we're going to get out on the land. We teach our kids a little meditation technique. Some of the things we've tried in other schools is we sit kids down at trees and have them meditate or clear their mind. We do different types of interacting things. Certainly when we do ceremonies with our kids in those circumstances where those things are, opportunities are allowed, we talk about those relationships with place in our language and in our culture. So I want to thank everyone. I really appreciate this invitation to share and to share with people outside of my culture. And that's one of the beautiful things with Melissa and our school. It's an example of, once again, how these two contentious worldviews can come together. And we're sharing our knowledge to be more responsible to place. And we're finding out more knowledge about place. We are centered in place. Our culture says that's what our culture is about, is place. I wish this is a short format. Teaching always should be face to face. There's always that spirituality when we're together. And all this teaching of place and spirit, it should be done place to place. But I know due to what's happening these days, Zoom is the place to be. I'm teaching university on Zoom. A lot of my other meetings are Zoom. But I appreciate the invitation and look forward to the day when we can be together and talk more about these things. I've really skimmed and went fast over a lot of things, but I really wanted to give kind of a context and a sense of what land-based education looks like to us, and really that message of reconciliation, that message that we are all in this together, and we all need to take that stewardship responsibility very seriously. And I know in your work, that's exactly what you do, and you're teaching that stewardship responsibility about place. And really, that's how we're going to save this place, is by all of us giving our head a shake and saying, oh, shoot, we haven't been living up to our responsibilities. We haven't been learning about the things we needed to learn about in the places we occupy, and how our impacts reverberate throughout that ecosystem. There's a reason why polar bears have toxins from Chinese factories. Everything's connected. We need to understand that all our impacts impact everything, and vice versa. So once again, I'll say in Yahweh for having me here. I know that there might be a few questions, but really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Nicole, who is another teacher at Hillside School, taught me when I'm very, very grateful, I don't just say miigwech, I say chi miigwech. So thank you very much for speaking to us today and sharing your thoughts. Before we open it up for Q&A, I just wanted to take a moment and just mention one of the slides that really impacted me. And I know I said at the beginning that every time I speak with you, Steve, I learn something new. You mentioned something about the land being the first teacher, and that the land being the place where we're going to find our healing. And I think that as outdoor educators and interpreters, which most of us here today are, I think that we all know that intrinsically ourselves. And I found that to be a really interesting sort of similarity maybe between the work that you're doing and then the work that we're trying to do as well. And so those two statements really kind of just dug in deep with me. And I thank you for sharing them and for making that connection just so obvious. There are lots of thank yous coming up in the chat as well. I don't know if you have that open, Steve, but I'm seeing lots of folks sending their thanks there. And we do have a couple of questions, so if you will entertain us. The first one comes from Bonnie, and the question is, how can we help displaced Indigenous youth find their place where they are currently learning? So I'm assuming, I know Bonnie, I believe, is in the Simcoe School Board. So I'm assuming she's thinking about it from more of an urban context.
Even in an urban context, educators have to do the same work we have to do at Hillside. And that's bringing in those oral knowledge keepers. Once again, we can find some information in books and stuff, but the knowledge is within the hearts of those people who have lived that knowledge. So whether you're in Barrie, here in Forest, in Toronto, there's oral knowledge keepers everywhere. There's people that reside in the city that carry that knowledge. So your responsibility as an educator, the same with mine, this is a big part of my work as director of ed and principal at Hillside. I'm from Six Nations, I'm not from Kettle Point. My year and a half there has been spent establishing relationships with elders and the knowledge keepers in that community. So if we want to bring that knowledge in for our kids, that's where we start, with those knowledge keepers. And once again, not as a once off, oh, thanks so-and-so for being here, but that knowledge was delivered. How do we extend it? How do we enhance it? And how do we keep inviting those people in to do those things? So great question, but it's the same for all educators. We got to find those knowledge keepers. It's not in a Reader's Digest book series. It's in the hearts and minds, and a lot of times there's protocols for reaching out to those people. You know, you got to offer them tobacco, and no knowledge keeper is ever going to knock on your school door and say, "Hey, you don't want to learn this?" That's part of our responsibility as learners, because an elder doesn't hand out knowledge. It needs to go where someone's requesting it. So it's sacred knowledge and it's important knowledge. So you need to follow those protocols, but reach out to those people. They're everywhere. Call your local friendship center, call your local reserve and say, hey, I'm looking for someone who may be able to deliver some knowledge. We get into a bit of a debate about honorariums. Even our own schools sometimes say, oh, you know, they're an elder, they're supposed to share that knowledge. I always contend they're like the literacy person we're paying $250 to come and do a workshop with our teachers. Pay that elder $250. That knowledge is just as, if not more important. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Steve. And I think that's part of why I really wanted to share that land acknowledgement, because I really kind of enjoyed, although I'm not a classroom teacher, I enjoyed that piece of, you know, it's a good focal point maybe and a big motivator to start bringing in those, inviting in those elders and those knowledge keepers and just keeping that conversation going, right? And Krista, who was amazing when I spoke to her, the teacher behind those, she had suggested it's about building new relationships and finding new ways to be able to communicate, and I thought that was really interesting as well. And as a side note, when I asked Steve if he would be willing to talk to us today, the reason he gave me why he was going to say yes, despite the fact that his schedule is, I'm sure, very busy, was that when people ask for knowledge, then Steve suggested it was his responsibility to share. So we're very, very grateful, Steve, for that. There is another question in the Q&A, and I just want to remind folks, if you have any more questions, please put them in the question and answer so that we can spot them there easily. The next one is, where is the dividing line between knowledge and sharing if I'm not Indigenous but an ally?
That's quite the question. Obviously, with Indigenous knowledge, I'm not going to get on this Zoom and start talking about anything I don't know, or I only talk from my own experience. That would be a question you would ask that knowledge keeper. First of all, if they're coming in to deliver it to the school, that right there tells you right away it's knowledge that can be shared. A great question for that person who would come in and talk to your class would be, how could you help us extend this? How can I, as a non-Indigenous person, share this? Which is a great opportunity for me to say this. We're all Indigenous. We all came from Indigenous people. Whether your ancestors were Indigenous 5,000 years ago or 200 years ago, we all have that in us. There's a great book, I didn't bring it with me, but it's a book about, I think it's called Beyond Trees or something like that. And it's a German guy who's working a woodlot in Germany. And he wrote this book that sounds so Indigenous to me, and it's all from his learning. And he too says that these plants live and that they help each other and that they support each other. So we are allies. We are all together on this earth. We're all brothers and sisters. The only time I would be worried about sharing knowledge is if it's a spiritual knowledge that only certain people can do those type of things. But that general knowledge, once again, if a knowledge keeper is coming into your school, that's knowledge you can share. And once again, ask them for that guidance, enhance it and support it. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And just from my own personal experience, and Steve, feel free to hop into the conversation if you think I'm out of line, but something that I always try and do is if I've learned a piece of knowledge and then I want to share that piece of knowledge again, I'm just very careful to let people know where that knowledge came from. So I have an Indigenous friend, and she lives at Kettle Point, and she taught me this. I feel comfortable doing it that way, and the Indigenous people that I've spoken to about it also seem to think that that's a fair, honest way to share that knowledge as well. So I wouldn't share knowledge that hadn't come to me directly. And that's how I sort of balance it. I see some head nods. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we have another question here. Sort of along the same line. What do you think about the opinion that teachers shouldn't teach views or practices that aren't from their background and only should be taught by members of that culture?
Yeah, that is somewhat similar, but in Ontario, you have a program called First Nation, Métis, and Inuit Initiative, which mandates classrooms and teachers in the Ontario provincial schools to teach cultural knowledge, First Nations knowledge. So, you know, it's mandated. Once again, history, anyone can teach First Nations history. Once again, with the addition of the oral knowledge keepers. History is a series of stories. If we're going to teach Indigenous history, we need to include the Indigenous story, the Indigenous perspective of that time in history. So, you know, as educators, you work in a system that tells you, they put that responsibility on you through their policy to teach First Nations culture. I would contend that you need to do it in conjunction with a First Nations person, which there's some issues that I have when we don't involve First Nations issues. Going back to your question, I mean, you need that assistance. Just like if I was to teach Buddhism or something like that, I need someone who's a Buddhist who can help me. I might be the technical educator who can put it in a curriculum and deliver it in the classroom, but I need that Buddhist person to help me with that knowledge.
Thank you. And this next question, should we reach out to a variety of Indigenous communities to gain a more diverse perspective of all Indigenous cultures, or focus more on our own local communities?
Local communities, focus on the place you're in, focus on the local communities. If you don't have a good understanding of Indigenous knowledge and you start talking to different places, you're gonna get confused. You talk to the local place, you get your foundation of what Indigenous knowledge is, of that education. If you start there's some values and perspectives that all First Nations people have, but there's also some very diverse teachings and ways to celebrate and enhance relationships. So once again, keep it to your local area.
Thanks, Steve. Next question here. Oh, I think it accidentally got moved. Leaving this conversation, what do you suggest our first step should be, aside from finding the knowledge keepers? So I guess maybe finding the knowledge keepers is step one. What would step two be?
I'm sorry, I missed the step one part.
Leaving this conversation, what do you suggest our first step is, aside from finding the knowledge keepers?
First step would be, how does it fit into Ontario curriculum? Because once again, you don't want it to be an extracurricular situation. How do I fit this in the curriculum to make it part of the classroom curriculum in practice? That would be for the first step. There's also many online resources of Indigenous lesson plans. Once again, just like with Buddhism, I could download a Buddhism lesson plan and teach it. It's going to be a very narrow, one-sided, shallow piece of information I'm going to deliver. I need that Buddhist person with me to help guide that knowledge and help enhance it. So, that would be your first step. You've already contacted the knowledge person to deliver the knowledge. How does it fit in the curriculum? And, something that I do as a First Nations person is I have a network of people that know more than what I do about certain aspects of land-based education. And so I'm constantly reaching out to those people. So that would be another great suggestion, is creating that network of support. What are people doing in other classrooms? Making partnerships with classrooms on reserve schools. That would be a good next step too. I'm sorry, I have about 5 more minutes, so I could take a couple more questions maybe.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I think you've answered most of the questions that I've seen come through. And I would just echo what you said. Relationships are so very important, right? And I think most of us working in conservation authorities, we know that we have to work with lots of partners. It's just how we operate as a conservation authority as a whole, but also in our own departments, I'm sure. And so taking the time to start those relationships, and then the next steps just sort of present themselves. That's been my personal experience. So I know that your time is limited, Steve. So I just wanted to again say thank you. The information that you shared today has been generated a lot of discussion. It's been super valuable to myself personally, and I'm very excited to communicate with my peers in the future and find out all of the things they learned from you. I also want to take the time to thank everybody else for joining and for giving Steve your attention. I'm sure they would all love to clap and high five you and all of those wonderful things if they could in person. So we do have a few housekeeping things as a committee that I'd like to talk to everybody about. But Steve, if you need to go, and if you wanted to say your goodbyes now, I can do that afterwards.
Sure. Once again, thank you so much for everyone listening today and being a part of this. It's kind of a one-way conversation. That's kind of the nature of Zoom, but would love to extend the conversation with anyone. Melissa, you're more than welcome to give out my contact information if you like. Once again, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed it. And I'm happy to be part of this sharing. So in Yahweh, and have a great day.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
So for everyone else that's still on, I'm just going to switch my screen over here. Just a couple of pieces that I wanted to take care of before we sign off for the day. I wanted to once again remind everybody that the Innovation Award nominees have been uploaded on the Cataraqui CA website. So if you guys could go there, I'm sure Karen can share the link to that in the chat. A reminder that a recording of the webinar will be sent out to everybody and anybody who missed today as well. So if there's anything you wanted to go back and review, please feel free. If you haven't already joined our Facebook group, please consider doing that. There's lots of nice conversations happening there, and I've certainly been enjoying it myself, and I'm not even a Facebooker, so that's kind of saying a lot. And if you haven't already signed up for everything else going on this week, please do so. We have a speaker again tomorrow, Elizabeth, who's talking to us the inside scoop on benthic invertebrates. So she comes highly recommended, incredibly knowledgeable person. And since we all do pond studies or stream studies, I think there's something there for all of us to learn. Stana will be doing some virtual forest therapy walks with us on Thursdays. On Thursday, there's 2 sessions there. I'm not 100% sure if they still have space in them. I do know they have limited space. So hopefully if there's still some space there, you guys can scoop up those last spaces if you haven't already. And then we're all super excited about our virtual campfire on Friday. We're going to try and encapsulate the beauty of all being together in the same place and having that camaraderie around the fire. Dan will be hosting and we're going to have music from Dwayne. So we're all really excited about that as well. So if you have not had the chance to sign up for those, please do so. I think that might be all from me. Karen, have I forgotten anything that we should say before we sign off?
No, you rocked it.
Okay, awesome. So thanks again, everybody, for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today, and for those thoughtful questions for Steve, and for entertaining my dream to have him speak to all of you so that you can maybe learn some of the things that I've been grateful to learn from him. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully see you tomorrow.